Welcome back to The Last Whisper. I'm your host, and this episode examines one of the most disturbing documented family histories ever recorded. The Addington story isn't meant for those who frighten easily. What started as a simple tale of ambition and prosperity quickly took a much darker turn, a shadow that would linger within Addington Manor's halls across countless generations. Before proceeding, I should warn you. The account I'm about to share has been reconstructed from scattered historical records, private journals, and classified government documents that were never intended for public release. Some of tonight's material was deliberately concealed by authorities who felt society wasn't prepared for such revelations. Others might dismiss these events as mere superstition or the ravings of troubled minds. However, as you'll come to understand, the recurring pattern spanning centuries proves too consistent, too exact to be mere coincidence or shared hallucination. For more sensitive viewers, now might be the appropriate moment to reconsider continuing. Addington Manor's horrors extend beyond the merely physical into the existential. They force us to question our fundamental understanding of reality itself. They imply that beneath our ordered world's thin surface lurks something immense and incomprehensible, something that has used one family across generations as its passage into our dimension. You have been warned. Back in 1842, Edward Addington, a ruthless businessman of considerable ambition, acquired a vast estate across northern England's misty highlands. The property, previously belonging to the disgraced Blackwood family, was available at a remarkably low price. Local gossip suggested the land carried a curse, but Edward dismissed these tales as simple country ignorance. Where others perceived darkness, he saw potential. This would prove the first of many catastrophic misjudgments that would come to characterize the Addington name. The surrounding region held deep ancient significance, with Neolithic stone circles scattered across the moors and prehistoric burial grounds nestled within the estate's shadow. Archaeologists had long theorized that the area served as a significant ritual center for pre-Celtic peoples, potentially chosen because of certain qualities we might now term electromagnetic or geological anomalies. What ancient cultures interpreted as divine presence, contemporary science might explain through unusual natural phenomena. However, as this narrative progresses, you may wonder whether such neat distinctions hold up under scrutiny. Edward had accumulated his wealth through coal and steel industries built upon exploited labor. The Industrial Revolution swept across England, and Edward positioned himself at its sharp edge, quite literally, given that his factories reported among the nation's highest worker mortality rates. His mines plunged deeper than any others, extracting coal from depths competitors deemed too hazardous or unprofitable. Miners occasionally spoke of strange fossils discovered in those deepest tunnels, creatures defying conventional classification, though such curiosities tended to disappear once management caught wind. Edward's reputation for cruelty preceded him, though few comprehended its full extent. Those who opposed him had an uncanny tendency to vanish, their fates sealed behind closed doors with whispered agreements and handshakes. Labor organizers occasionally washed ashore along the tempestuous river, their tongues removed, a detail newspapers wisely omitted. Edward believed power wasn't inherited but seized through whatever means necessary. His fascination with power extended beyond material concerns. Despite publicly dismissing superstition, Edward maintained an extensive private collection of occult texts and employed various tutors to teach him ancient languages. Hebrew, Sanskrit, and others far more obscure. Visitors to his London residence occasionally glimpsed strange evening gatherings attended by prominent British society and political figures. What occurred during these meetings was never openly discussed, though servants murmured about chanting, peculiar odors, and guests departing somehow diminished, as though something essential had been extracted. After relocating to the manor with his young wife Eleanor and their 5 children, Edward commissioned substantial renovations. Workers were brought from distant regions. None were local, as nearby villagers refused to set foot on the property. Most were desperate immigrants who couldn't understand warnings whispered in local pubs. Those who did speak English found their concerns dismissed or met with deportation threats. The renovation crew resided in temporary quarters on the grounds, and from the beginning, they reported peculiar incidents. Many complained about strange sounds within the walls, not typical house settling, but rhythmic tapping that seemed to follow patterns, almost like coded messages. Workers described sudden temperature drops, even during warm summer days, cold spots so intense their breath would mist and frost would form on their tools. Most unsettling was the persistent sensation of being watched, especially in the East Wing, where men refused to work alone. Edward employed a foreman notorious for harsh management to maintain worker compliance. Complaints resulted in wage reductions or immediate termination. Despite these measures, the project fell behind schedule as workers fled during the night, abandoning their belongings rather than spend another moment at Addington Manor. 3 workers perished under mysterious circumstances during renovation. The first, a stonemason named Gregor, fell from scaffolding while working on the East Wing facade. Witnesses reported that moments before falling, Gregor had been staring intently at something within the room, his face frozen in terror. The second, a carpenter called Thomas, drowned in the estate's lake despite being known as a strong swimmer who had once rescued a child from the treacherous river. His body was discovered floating face down in the lake center with no struggle signs or injuries except his eyes, which had turned completely white, as if bleached. The third death proved most disturbing. A young apprentice named William was discovered hanging in the cellar with no apparent means of reaching such a position. The beam from which he hung stood nearly 15 feet high with no nearby furniture that could have provided access. More puzzling still, the rope around his neck showed no knot marks. It appeared as a continuous loop, as though woven around his flesh. Local authorities, heavily influenced by Edward's substantial donations to the county magistrate and police commissioner, ruled all 3 deaths unfortunate accidents. The magistrate, Sir Reginald Thorpe, frequently attended Edward's London gatherings and shared his interest in esoteric matters. Later investigation would reveal that Thorpe's family maintained ancestral connections to the Blackwoods, though he carefully concealed this fact. Construction persisted despite the fatalities, with new workers replacing those who had died or fled. Edward offered substantial completion bonuses, doubling then tripling the amount as difficulties mounted. Within 6 months, at exorbitant cost both financial and human, Addington Manor stood transformed into a Victorian opulence showcase. The final structure represented a monument to excess and questionable taste. The exterior presented a harmonious Gothic revival facade complete with pointed arches and ornate stonework rising imperiously above carefully manicured grounds. However, the interior offered a disorienting blend of styles and influences reflecting Edward's eclectic obsessions. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings painted with suspiciously accurate astronomical charts depicting celestial bodies unknown to contemporary astronomy. Persian carpets covered polished hardwood floors inlaid with patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different perspectives. Priceless paintings adorned deep crimson and midnight blue walls, many depicting scenes from obscure mythological traditions, sacrificial rituals, and entities neither fully human nor fully bestial. Most striking was the library occupying the entire West Wing. Rising 3 stories with spiral staircases connecting the levels, it housed one of England's finest private collections of rare books. Beyond expected classics and contemporary works, Edward's collection included ancient volumes bound in materials defying easy identification. Scholars later permitted to examine the library described texts in languages with no known speakers, written on substances resembling neither paper nor parchment. These books were maintained in a special section behind locked glass doors, visible but inaccessible to casual visitors. Yet despite its grandeur, something undeniably oppressive permeated Addington Manor's atmosphere. Guests invited to the elaborate housewarming celebration in December 1842 rarely stayed overnight despite the treacherous winter journey awaiting them. Those who did reported troubled sleep and disturbing dreams. Lady Harrington, a close friend of Eleanor's, recorded in her diary, "There's something unhealthy about that house's air. It feels thick in your lungs, as if carrying some invisible contamination. I woke repeatedly feeling watched, and once I could swear I saw the doorknob turning slowly, though the door remained locked. I won't accept another Addington Manor invitation. Friendship be damned." Eleanor Addington, once vibrant and sociable, grew increasingly withdrawn as winter deepened into an unusually harsh spring. Where she had been known for wit and lively conversation, she now spoke little at social gatherings, her gaze distant and troubled. She dismissed her long-time lady's maid, claiming the woman was spying on her, and began refusing food prepared by kitchen staff, subsisting largely on tea and dry toast she prepared herself. She spoke of hearing children's laughter in empty corridors and glimpsing figures passing doorways from her peripheral vision. Most troubling to staff was her new habit of stopping mid-sentence, tilting her head as if listening to a voice only she could hear, then responding in whispers to empty air. Edward dismissed her concerns, attributing them to female hysteria, a convenient diagnosis for any woman expressing discomfort in Victorian England. "The house is merely settling," he would say with thinly veiled irritation. Nothing more. But Eleanor knew better. Something malevolent inhabited Addington Manor, something that seemed to feed on fear and despair. She began maintaining a journal documenting the strange occurrences Edward so readily dismissed. Her handwriting, once elegant and controlled, grew increasingly erratic as entries progressed, her pen sometimes tearing through paper. Her entries grew increasingly disturbed as weeks became months. April 18, 1843, I discovered William, their youngest son, speaking to the wall in the East Wing again. When I asked who he was talking to, he said, "The sad lady who lives inside." Edward says it's merely childish imagination. But William described her in such detail, the lace collar of her dress, the pearl buttons down her back, the dark stain spreading across her abdomen. No child could invent such specifics. When I pressed him, William said the lady told him she had lived in the house long ago and that the master heard her because of the baby. I asked if he meant Edward, and William looked confused. "No, Mother," she said, "it was before the fire. There has been no fire at Addington Manor in living memory." April 30, 1843, Margaret's governess gave notice today. She claims Margaret threatened her with a knife taken from the breakfast table, saying, "They told me to open you up and see what's inside." When confronted, Margaret had no memory of the incident and wept inconsolably. "The poor child hasn't been herself since we moved here. Her night terrors have worsened, and she's taken to collecting dead insects, arranging them in patterns on her windowsill. Dr. Wallace prescribed a tonic to help her sleep, but it only seems to make the nightmares more vivid. This morning, she told me she doesn't want to be hollowed out like the others. When I asked what she meant, she stared at me as if I were a stranger." May 3, 1843, the temperature in the master bedroom dropped so severely last night that I could see my breath. Edward slept soundly while I lay awake, watching a dark figure stand motionless at our bed's foot for hours. I was paralyzed, unable to scream or wake him. The figure seemed composed of shadow deeper than surrounding darkness, with only the suggestion of a face, 2 depressions where I should be, and a darker slash that might have been a mouth. It made no sound, no movement, simply watched. When dawn's first light broke through the curtains, it dissolved like smoke. Edward found me weeping and suggested I visit Dr. Harrison for a tonic to calm my nerves. I fear he thinks I'm going mad. Perhaps I am. May 17, 1843, I ventured into the East Wing today, drawn by a woman's weeping. I found nothing, but the crying seemed to follow me, always just around the next corner or behind the next door. Eventually, I reached the room at the corridor's end, the one Edward has taken as his private study. The door was locked, but I'm certain the sounds came from within. When I pressed my ear to the wood, the weeping stopped abruptly, replaced by a whisper so close it might have been inside my own head. "He will hollow you out, too." I fled, but as I reached the main staircase, I glanced back to see Edward standing outside his study door, watching me with an expression I've never seen before. Not anger, but cold, calculating assessment, as if I were a specimen under glass. June 17, 1843, 3 more servants have given notice this week. That makes 11 who have left since we moved in. They whisper about rooms that lock themselves, objects moving without being touched, and voices crying from empty rooms. The undergardener swears he saw a procession of figures in white moving across the lawn at midnight, heading toward the old stone circle on the north edge of the property. The new nursemaid refuses to enter the children's rooms after dark, claiming she sees something standing over them as they sleep. Edward has forbidden any discussion of these incidents, threatening immediate dismissal without reference for anyone spreading hysterical nonsense. He grows more distant by the day, spending hours locked in his study or the East Wing library. When he does emerge, there's a feverish gleam in his eyes and a tremor in his hands he cannot quite control. July 2, 1843, the twins have developed a peculiar game they call the Hollow People. They take turns standing perfectly still while the other drapes them in sheets and pretends to extract something invisible from their chest. When I asked Alexander what they were removing, he replied matter-of-factly, "The light inside, Mother. That's what they want from us." Victoria nodded solemnly and added, "The hungry ones behind the walls need it to make themselves real. I've forbidden the game, but I hear them playing it when they think I'm not listening. Last night, I observed them through a crack in their bedroom door. They weren't using sheets anymore, but standing in moonlight, making precise cutting motions in the air before their bodies. Most disturbing was their synchronicity. They moved as if controlled by a single mind." As Eleanor's mental state deteriorated, Edward became increasingly absent, spending long hours in his study or away on business. His complexion took on a grayish pallor, and he lost weight rapidly, his once robust frame becoming almost skeletal. Yet a feverish energy remained, a manic intensity that manifested in bursts of activity followed by days of near catatonia. Household staff reported that he would sometimes be found standing motionless in odd house corners, staring intently at blank walls or empty air, mumbling equations and phrases in languages none recognized. The children were largely left in the care of nannies and tutors, most of whom rarely lasted more than a few weeks before fleeing Addington Manor's oppressive atmosphere. Young William developed a stutter and began wetting his bed. Margaret was caught multiple times attempting to harm smaller children from the village when they ventured too near the estate boundaries. The twins, Alexander and Victoria, seemed to communicate in a private language, falling silent whenever adults entered the room. Only Charles, the eldest at 16, appeared relatively unaffected, though servants noted he had taken to carrying a silver letter opener at all times and barricading his bedroom door at night. By autumn, the situation had deteriorated further. Eleanor's journal entries became increasingly fragmented and difficult to decipher. She wrote of geometries that hurt the eyes and voices that speak from behind time. She drew diagrams that made no mathematical sense yet created a disturbing sense of depth when stared at too long. Several pages contained nothing but the same phrase, repeated hundreds of times, "They are hollowing us out one by one." The turning point arrived on a stormy night in November 1843. Eleanor, unable to sleep, wandered the east wing corridors, an area of the house that Edward had inexplicably declared off-limits to everyone, including family. The last coherent entry in her journal, dated November 13th, describes her decision to defy this prohibition. "I can bear it no longer. The sounds from behind the walls have become unbearable. Not just weeping now, but screams that slice through my dreams and leave me bleeding into wakefulness. Edward has forbidden any of us from entering the East Wing's third floor. But he himself spends hours there, returning with a look of terrible exultation that chills my blood. Tonight, while he is away in London, I shall discover what secret he guards so jealously. May God forgive my trespass and protect me from what I might find." What she discovered there would forever alter the Addington family's course. According to fragmentary accounts later pieced together from servants' testimonies and Charles's hidden journal, Eleanor used a stolen key to access the locked staircase leading to the East Wing's third floor. The area had been completely transformed from its original design. The multiple rooms shown on the architect's plans had been converted into a single vast chamber with an oddly disorienting layout, corners that seemed more or less than 90 degrees, a ceiling that appeared to recede infinitely upward in some places while pressing claustrophobically low in others. But it was the floor that drew Eleanor's horrified attention. The expensive Persian carpets found throughout the rest of the manor were absent here. Instead, the entire floor was covered in an intricate mosaic composed of thousands of tiny tiles and various materials, some stone, some metal, some materials she could not identify. Together, they formed an immense geometric pattern that seemed to shift and pulsate in the flickering candlelight. At this pattern's center sat a circular depression about 6 feet in diameter. Behind a false wall concealed by a tapestry, Eleanor found a hidden chamber. The room was small and windowless, its walls covered in strange symbols etched into the stone. In the center stood a pedestal holding a leather-bound book. Eleanor would later describe it in her journal as ancient beyond reckoning, its cover fashioned from some material I dare not contemplate too deeply. The pages contained writings in several languages, some recognizable as Latin and Greek, others utterly foreign to Eleanor's educated eye. Interspersed among the text were disturbing illustrations depicting ritual sacrifice and communion with entities that seemed neither human nor animal, but some horrific combination of both. Careful examination of these images revealed a terrible pattern. Each depicted a circular chamber with a distinctive floor pattern identical to the one in the room Eleanor had just left. Most disturbing were the illustrations showing human figures arranged in specific positions around the central depression, their chests open to reveal not the expected internal organs, but vast starry voids, as if each human body contained an entire cosmos being somehow harvested or channeled. The book's final pages contained names and dates spanning centuries, with Edward Addington's name and the date December 21, 1843, the winter solstice, inscribed in fresh ink. Eleanor had discovered Edward's darkest secret. His fortune had not been built on business acumen alone, but on forbidden knowledge and terrible pacts with forces beyond human understanding. Addington Manor's renovations had not been merely aesthetic. They had transformed the property into a massive sigil, a beacon to attract entities from beyond reality's veil. And the deaths during construction had not been accidents, but deliberate sacrifices, their life energy used to power whatever terrible mechanism Edward was creating. When Edward discovered Eleanor in the hidden chamber, his rage was terrifying. According to Harriet Brown, a housemaid who had followed Eleanor out of concern for her mistress's safety, Edward's face underwent a horrifying transformation as he confronted his wife. "It weren't natural what I saw," Harriet later testified to a parish priest seeking absolution for her failure to intervene. His lordship's face seemed to ripple like there was something moving beneath the skin. And his eyes, God help me, but they weren't human eyes anymore. They were like windows opening onto somewhere else, somewhere vast and cold and hungry. Servants reported hearing shouting followed by an eerie silence. Most disturbing was Eleanor's scream, which began as a normal expression of human terror but transformed mid-cry into something defying description, a sound that seemed to come from multiple throats simultaneously, modulating in ways human vocal cords should not be capable of producing. The next morning, Edward announced that Eleanor had suffered a nervous collapse and would be recuperating at a private sanatorium in Switzerland. He produced letters supposedly written by Eleanor over the following months describing her treatment and gradual recovery, but the handwriting bore only passing resemblance to her own. She was never seen again. In the household accounts ledger, there is an entry dated November 14, 1843, the day after Eleanor's disappearance, for an unusually large delivery of quicklime, a substance commonly used to accelerate decomposition and mask decay odor. The delivery was made to the East Wing, and workers were forbidden from entering the area for several days afterward. When they were finally permitted to resume their duties, they reported that the mosaic floor in the large chamber had been extensively cleaned with several damaged tiles replaced. In the months that followed, Edward's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He dismissed all but the most essential staff and kept his children under strict isolation. No visitors were permitted, and the children were withdrawn from their schools and social engagements. A physician, Dr. James Morrison, was summoned regularly to the manor, but the nature of his treatments remained undocumented. Local gossip suggested that the doctor, once respected in the community, had developed a laudanum addiction and substantial gambling debt shortly before being retained by Edward Addington. Locals reported strange lights emanating from the manor at odd hours and unsettling sounds carrying across the moors on still nights, sounds that resembled chanting in no known language, punctuated by what some described as countless voices weeping in unison. Farmers reported livestock found dead near the property boundaries, their bodies drained of blood without visible wounds. Most disturbing were reports of missing children from surrounding villages. 7 disappeared between December 1843 and June 1844, all within a 10-mile radius of Addington Manor. Official investigations attributed these disappearances to accidents or runaways, but local families remained convinced of a more sinister explanation. The eldest Addington child, Charles, began documenting his own observations in a hidden journal after his mother's disappearance. His writings, discovered decades later concealed in a hollowed-out section of the manor's west wall, provide a chilling account of the family's descent into madness and the true horror unfolding within Addington Manor's walls. "Father has changed," wrote 16-year-old Charles in December 1843. His eyes seem different, somehow deeper, with a strange gleam that was not there before. He spends hours locked in the East Wing, and when he emerges, he often doesn't recognize us immediately. Last week, he called me by a name I've never heard before, then looked confused and retired to his study without supper. By spring of 1844, the remaining servants reported that Edward had taken to sleepwalking, often found standing motionless in the children's rooms in the dead of night, watching them sleep with unnatural stillness. The children themselves began exhibiting disturbing behaviors. 10-year-old William was discovered mutilating small animals in the garden. 12-year-old Margaret began speaking in languages she had never studied. The twins, Alexander and Victoria, developed an obsession with death, creating elaborate funeral rituals for their dolls and pets. Only Charles seemed to maintain his sanity, though his journal entries betray a growing fear that whatever had taken hold of his family might claim him too. He began planning an escape, secretly corresponding with his mother's brother in London. "I fear what father is becoming," Charles wrote in April 1844. "Yesterday, I saw him in the garden at dawn, burying something wrapped in bloody sheets. When he returned to the house, there was soil beneath his fingernails and a serenity to his expression that chilled me to the bone. I have not seen Margaret since the previous afternoon." Charles never managed to escape. On May 17, 1844, a fire broke out in Addington Manor's East Wing. By the time the local fire brigade arrived, the blaze had consumed most of the house. They found Edward Addington in the garden, calmly watching the inferno with what witnesses described as an expression of rapturous fulfillment. Inside the charred remains of the manor, authorities discovered a scene of unspeakable horror. The bodies of all 5 Addington children were found in the cellar, arranged in a precise geometric pattern around a stone altar. Forensic examination would later reveal that the children had not died in the fire, but had been systematically sacrificed in what appeared to be an elaborate ritual. Edward Addington was arrested and committed to Bedlam Asylum, where he spent the remainder of his days in seemingly catatonic silence. However, asylum records indicate that he would occasionally become animated during certain astronomical alignments, attempting to draw complex symbols with whatever materials were available, often his own blood. The Addington case might have faded into obscurity, dismissed as the isolated madness of one depraved individual, had it not been for what happened next. Despite the horrific events and the manor's almost complete destruction, a distant cousin of Edward's, James Addington, claimed the property in 1850 and set about rebuilding it according to the original plans. James was a respected scholar with no known history of mental instability or cruelty. His decision to resurrect Addington Manor puzzled many, but he dismissed concerns with rational explanations about family legacy and the remaining structure's quality. Within 2 years, the manor stood once again, an exact replica of its former self. History, as they say, has a way of repeating itself. Within months of moving in with his wife and 3 children, James began exhibiting the same obsessive behaviors that had characterized Edward's decline. His wife, Rebecca, documented increasingly disturbing changes in her husband's personality and strange occurrences within the newly rebuilt manor. James spent 3 days and nights in the East Wing without emerging even for meals, she wrote to her sister in 1853. When he finally appeared, he looked somehow younger, more vital. Yet, there was something wrong about his eyes. They seemed to reflect light differently, like a cat's eyes in darkness. When I expressed concern about his absence, he smiled in a way that made my blood run cold and said, "I was never absent, my dear. I've been here all along watching you sleep." The pattern established by Edward Addington repeated itself with frightening precision through James and subsequent generations of Addingtons who inhabited the manor. Each time the family patriarch would discover something in the East Wing that changed him. Each time family members would vanish or die under mysterious circumstances. And each time, locals would report strange lights and sounds emanating from the property on specific dates corresponding to ancient pagan festivals. Parish records from the neighboring village of Thornfield document a disturbing trend. During periods when the Addington family was in residence at the manor, disappearances of local children increased dramatically. Between 1850 and 1870, 23 children vanished without trace within a 10-mile radius of Addington Manor. Local authorities investigated, but could never find sufficient evidence to implicate the increasingly reclusive Addington family. By the turn of the century, Addington Manor had been rebuilt 3 times following mysterious fires, and 4 generations of Addingtons had met violent ends within its walls. Still, distant relatives would emerge to claim the property, drawn by some inexplicable compulsion to restore the manor and continue whatever dark purpose it served. In 1901, the property passed to Richard Addington, a successful London physician with a young family and no previous connection to his ancestry's more sinister aspects. He approached the reconstruction with scientific skepticism, determined to dispel the superstitious nonsense surrounding his family name. The so-called Addington curse is nothing more than a confluence of unfortunate circumstances, perhaps exacerbated by environmental factors such as carbon monoxide from faulty heating systems, which could explain the reported hallucinations and erratic behaviors, he wrote in a letter to a colleague. I intend to document everything methodically and finally put these ridiculous rumors to rest. Richard installed electric lighting throughout the manor, a modern innovation at the time, and hired a team of scientists to analyze the air quality, water supply, and structural integrity of the building. His rational approach seemed promising initially, but within 6 months, his correspondence took a darker turn. There is something here, he wrote in increasingly agitated handwriting, something that defies scientific explanation. I've seen it moving through the walls at night. I've heard it whispering in languages that have been dead for millennia. The children hear it too. They've started drawing pictures of it. Elizabeth, his wife, says I'm working too hard, that my mind is playing tricks. But how can we all be experiencing the same delusion? His final letter, dated November 12, 1902, contains a disturbing revelation. The East Wing. Always the East Wing. I've discovered why. The original foundations remain intact beneath the newer construction. Edward wasn't the first. The Blackwoods before him and God knows how many others before them. They all found it. The chamber beneath the East Wing. It's far older than the manor. Older perhaps than England itself. The symbols on the walls match nothing in any archaeological record. Yet I recognize them somehow. They speak to something primitive in my brain. Something that existed before humanity crawled from the primordial ooze. God help me, I understand now what must be done. What has always been done. 3 days later, Richard's wife and children were found dead in their beds, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror. Richard himself was discovered in the cellar beneath the East Wing. His body contorted in an impossible position, surrounded by arcane symbols drawn in a mixture of blood and ash. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the responding officers would later require extensive psychiatric treatment for what they witnessed at the scene. Addington Manor was abandoned after the tragedy of 1902. The property fell into disrepair, becoming a magnet for thrill-seekers, occultists, and the morbidly curious. Local authorities eventually declared the structure unsafe and barricaded the grounds, but trespassers continued to find their way in. Many never came out again. In 1923, a group of Cambridge scholars specializing in anthropology and ancient religions gained legal access to the property for academic research. Led by Professor Walter Hartley, they intended to document the unusual symbols reported in the cellar and compare them to known occult traditions. Only one member of the expedition, a graduate student named Thomas Piper, returned alive. His account of what happened was so outlandish that he was initially committed to an asylum. His journals, however, provide the most comprehensive documentation of what may have been happening at Addington Manor for generations. The symbols in the cellar are not static, Piper wrote. They shift when not directly observed, rearranging themselves into new configurations. Professor Hartley believed they represent a form of non-Euclidean mathematics, equations designed to solve problems of dimensional transit. In simpler terms, the entire manor is a machine, a door to somewhere else. Piper's account suggests that the Addington family had been serving as caretakers of this door for generations, willingly or unwillingly. Each patriarch would discover the truth and become consumed by it, driven to maintain the integrity of the dimensional gateway through increasingly horrific sacrifices. What lies beyond the door cannot be described in human language, Piper continued. Hartley opened it. God help us all. He actually opened it. I saw only a glimpse as I fled, but that glimpse was enough to shatter my understanding of reality. The others weren't as fortunate. Their screams still echo in my dreams, but it wasn't pain they were expressing. It was rapture. Thomas Piper spent the rest of his life in self-imposed isolation, creating intricate paintings that attempted to capture what he had witnessed. The few surviving works are housed in a secure facility at Miskatonic University in Massachusetts, available for viewing only with special permission due to the documented psychological effects they have on observers. Following the Cambridge incident, the British government quietly acquired the Addington property. Official records indicate it was repurposed as a military storage facility during World War II, but declassified documents from the 1990s reveal a different story. Between 1939 and 1945, a specialized unit of British intelligence known as the Extraordinary Threats Division, ETD, occupied the manor, studying the phenomena reported there for potential application in the war effort. Colonel James Blackwood, a name that raises disturbing questions about his possible connection to the property's original owners, led the ETD operations at Addington Manor. His official reports describe anomalous energies and localized reality distortions centered around the East Wing. Whatever exists beneath Addington Manor defies conventional understanding, Blackwood wrote in a top-secret memorandum dated June 1943. It appears to respond to human intention and emotion, particularly fear and desire. The symbolic configurations in the cellar function as a form of programming language, allowing limited control over the phenomena, but at significant risk to the operator's psychological stability. The ETD conducted numerous experiments at the site, most of which ended disastrously. Test subjects exposed to the cellar for extended periods exhibited rapid personality deterioration, followed by either catatonia or extreme violence. Several researchers reported encountering doppelgangers of themselves or long-deceased family members in the East Wing corridors. Most disturbing were the temporal anomalies. Clocks in the manor ran at different speeds depending on their proximity to the cellar. In one documented incident, a researcher entered the East Wing for what he perceived as 20 minutes, but emerged 3 days later with no awareness of the time discrepancy. His journal contained over 200 pages of writing he had no memory of producing, mostly the same phrase repeated in increasingly distorted handwriting, "They are watching from behind the walls." By 1944, the casualties among ETD personnel had become unsustainable. Colonel Blackwood made the decision to seal the cellar with reinforced concrete and withdraw from the property. His final report contained a recommendation that Addington Manor be destroyed completely, the land salted, and the location stricken from all official records. "What we have contained here is not defeated," he wrote. "It is merely imprisoned, and imprisonment is not a permanent solution. There will always be those drawn to this place, those who hear the whispers promising power and knowledge beyond human comprehension. God help us if they succeed where we failed." The British government did not follow Blackwood's recommendation. Instead, they maintained a small monitoring station near the property, staffed by rotating personnel who were told they were tracking weather patterns. Surveillance continued quietly for decades with periodic reports of unusual phenomena, lights where no lights should be, temperature fluctuations, and electronic equipment failing inexplicably. In 1976, budget cuts led to the abandonment of even this minimal oversight. Addington Manor was left to rot, surrounded by overgrown grounds and protected only by no trespassing signs and local superstition. For nearly 20 years, it remained undisturbed, a cancerous memory fading slowly from public consciousness. Then in 1995, American tech entrepreneur Victor Reynolds purchased the property for what real estate records describe as a nominal fee. Reynolds had made his fortune in early internet technologies and had a well-documented interest in the paranormal. His stated intention was to renovate the historic manor and convert it into a private research facility dedicated to exploring the boundaries of conventional science. What Reynolds didn't reveal publicly was his connection to an obscure occult organization known as the Morphic Resonance Society. Founded in the 1920s, the society believed that certain locations served as focal points for consciousness itself, places where the barrier between thought and reality became permeable. Addington Manor featured prominently in their literature as a theoretical alpha site, the most powerful such location in Europe. Reynolds moved into the partially renovated manor in the spring of 1996, accompanied by a team of researchers from various scientific disciplines, all members of the Morphic Resonance Society. They brought with them cutting-edge technology, early brain-computer interfaces, quantum field detectors, and prototype reality mapping systems. "What the Addingtons stumbled upon through occult rituals, we will master through technology," Reynolds wrote in the project's mission statement. the gateway beneath Addington Manor isn't supernatural. It's a natural phenomenon that pre-scientific humans interpreted through a mystical lens. With the right tools and methodologies, we can strip away the superstition and harness what may be the most significant scientific discovery in human history. For 6 months, the research proceeded methodically. Reynolds published regular updates on a private server for society members, documenting measurable phenomena that defied conventional explanation, localized gravitational anomalies, spontaneous temperature fluctuations, and most intriguingly, what he described as information bleed, the appearance of data on their computers that none of the team had input. The entity or entities beyond the gateway appear to be attempting communication, Reynolds wrote in August 1996. The information manifests as complex mathematical equations and fragmented text in multiple languages, including several that our linguists cannot identify. Most provocative is the recurring phrase, which roughly translates to, "The door swings both ways." In September 1996, Reynolds' team made a breakthrough. Using ground-penetrating radar, they discovered that the concrete seal installed by the ETD in 1944 had fractured, creating a small opening into the chamber below. Environmental samples revealed trace particles of unknown composition with properties that defied analysis. The particles exhibit quantum superposition on a macroscopic scale, noted Dr. Eleanor Chen, the team's physicist. They exist in multiple states simultaneously and appear to respond to conscious observation. In simpler terms, they become what we expect them to be. This suggests that whatever lies beyond the gateway exists in a reality where thought directly influences matter. Reynolds made the decision to widen the opening and send in remote-controlled drones equipped with cameras and various sensors. The footage they recovered was disturbing in its implications. The chamber beyond the concrete seal had expanded far beyond its original dimensions, now appearing as a vast cathedral-like space with non-Euclidean geometry, angles that shouldn't be possible, distances that seem to change when viewed from different perspectives. The walls were covered in the same shifting symbols described by Thomas Piper decades earlier, but now they moved with unmistakable purpose, responding to the presence of the drones. Most unsettling were the glimpses of movement at the periphery of the camera's range, suggestions of forms that resembled humans but distorted as if viewed through rippling water. "We are being observed as much as we are observing," Reynolds noted. "The entities are learning from us, adapting to our methods of perception. Each incursion provides them with more information about our reality. We must consider the possibility that our research is serving their purposes rather than our own." Despite these concerns, Reynolds pushed forward. In October 1996, he proposed what he called a controlled communion, using the brain-computer interfaces to allow a human mind to perceive the gateway reality directly while remaining physically in our world. After much debate, Dr. Marcus Wayland, the team's neurologist, volunteered for the procedure. The experiment was conducted on October 31, 1996. Samhain on the Celtic calendar, one of the dates when historical accounts suggested the boundary between worlds was thinnest at Addington Manor. Wayland was connected to an array of monitoring equipment in a specially prepared room in the east wing directly above the chamber. What happened next is documented in the emergency recording automatically activated when the Manor systems detected a critical failure. The audio reveals Wayland's initial observations as his consciousness expanded into the gateway reality. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "Geometry impossible in our space. Colors I've never seen before that shouldn't exist. There are